one story to tell about Miles in choosing the candidate for president of Student Multicultural Association. In the kitchen, Miles heard her housemate, Ruth and Carla, arguing about something. Seems like a normal morning. Miles thought those two can never get along. "What has you got guys up and yelling so early in the morning?" Miles asked as she began making his breakfast. Both Ruth and Carla looked up and grinned at Miles. "You won't think it's a big deal, Miles," Carla said, "but we are discussing the candidate for the president of the Student Multicultural Association. There are two candidates. First, Laura Hughes. Laura Hughes was an American Asian graduate student, and she had presented a list of 10 points that represented her platform. She claimed to be interested in promoting cultural sensitivity and appreciation for diversity within the student body. Her flyer also listed a few ways that she planned to accomplish her goals. Her first big initiative, if she was elected, would be to sponsor a workshop with outside speakers and several hands-on activities to get students of different ethnicities talking to one another about difference and respect." Miles looked up at Ruth and Carla and said, "Well, Laura sounds reasonable enough." And then Carla interrupted. "Hey, you haven't even looked at what George had to say." So the other candidate, George, had chosen a completely different presentation style for her campaign flyer. Instead of laying out a specific platform point by point as Laura did for her campaign flyer, George's flyer told a series of short stories. In the first one, George related an incident in the class when an African-American woman couldn't get the professor's attention for anything she had to say. Every time she tried to contribute in the class, the professor ignored her and asked a European American's opinion, because she was the only black person in the class. This woman believed the professor was prejudiced, but she wasn't sure what she could do about that. Miles herself had been ignored in the classes and wondered if it had been because of her race. She would also experience being asked for the black opinion, and she really resented that. Also, her social life rarely included people outside her own race, except for Carla and a couple of Carla friends who were also Latinos, same like her. She never socialized with the white on campus. George had given Miles a lot to think about, and if she voted, she would vote for George. An interesting story. Throughout this book, did you realize that we began each chapter with a story about a person or several people who experienced something true that illustrates the chapter's theory? The reason this book made this choice may be found within the theory of narration that Walter Fisher called the narrative paradigm. The narrative paradigm promotes the belief that humans are a storyteller, and that values emotion and aesthetic background consideration of our beliefs and behaviors. In other words, we are more persuaded by a good story than a good argument. Thus, the theorist would explain Miles' decision to vote for George on the basis of the stories George presented in her campaign flyer. Fisher asserts that the essence of human nature is storytelling. This approach is founded on the principle that humans are storytelling animals. Furthermore, narrative logic is preferred over the rational logic used in argument. Narrative logic, or the logic of good reason, suggests that people judge the credibility of stories by whether their stories have coherence or ring true or have fidelity. Now let's move on to the assumption of this theory. First, the narrative paradigm assumes that the essential nature of human is rooted in a story and storytelling. As from Miles' illustration, stories persuade us, move us, and form the basis for our beliefs and action. Miles hadn't heard much about the election. In fact, Miles was rather apathetic about the election and had no real interest in it, either the candidate. Yet, after reading the compelling stories that George included in her campaign, Miles decided to vote for George. We use stories in virtually every aspect of our everyday lives. To pass the time, convey information, to let someone know who we are, to locate ourselves in place, family, and community. We turn to stories to both survive and to imagine, as well as for a host of instrumental purposes, for pleasure and because we must. Stories are part of our human inheritance. Next, the second assumption of the narrative paradigm asserts that people make decisions about which stories to accept and which stories to reject on the basis of what makes sense to them or good reasons. This assumption recognizes that not all stories are equally effective. From the previous story, Laura actually also told a story in her campaign flyer, but Miles simply chose to reject her story and accept George's story because it is more personally involving to her. The third assumption deals with what specifically influences people, choices, and provides good reason for them. The narrative paradigm assumes that narrative rationality is affected by history, biography, culture, and character. People are influenced by the context in which they are embedded. Therefore, the material that appears persuasive to Miles is the material that is specifically relevant to her personally. Next, the fourth assumption. The fourth assumption forms a core issue of the narrative approach. It asserts that people believe stories insofar as the story seems internally consistent and truthful. Finally, future perspective is based on the assumption that the world is a set of stories and we choose among them. We experience our life differently, allowing us to recreate our lives. From Miles' story, Miles' choose to support George may cause her to cast her own life story differently. She may no longer see herself as a loner. She may change her sense of political action based on her choice of George's story. Now, let's talk about the key concept in the narrative paradigm. Tracing the assumption of the narrative paradigm leads us to a consideration of some of the key concepts that form the core of this theory framework. There are narration, narrative rationality, and the logic of good reason. First, narration. Narration is often thought as a simply of a story, but for fiction, narration is much more than a plotted story with the beginning, middle, and ending. In fiction perspective, narration includes any verbal or non-verbal account with a sequence of events to which listener assigns a meaning. By narration, it means symbolic action, words, or deeds that have sequence or meaning for those who live, create, or interpret them. This definition implies the need for a storyteller and a listener. Next, the narrative rationality. The narrative rationality given that our lives are experienced in narrative. We need a method for judging which one to believe and which one to disregard. This standard can be found in narrative rationality, which provides us with a means for judging narrative that is quite differently from the traditional method found in the rational world paradigm. Narrative rationality, in contrast to traditional logic, operates on the basis of two different principles. First, coherence, and second is fidelity. Coherence refers to the internal consistency of a narrative. When judging a story coherence, the listener would ask whether the narrative seems to hang together in a consistent manner. Narrative possesses coherence when all the pieces of the story are present. We do not feel that the storyteller has left out important pieces in the element of story in any way. And there are three types of consistency. First, there is structural coherence, a type of coherence referring to the flow of the story. Next, there is material coherence, a type of coherence referring to the congruence between one story and other related story. And the last, characterological coherence, a type of coherence referring to the believability of the characters in the story. Next, there's fidelity. It means that the truthfulness or reliability of the story, and stories with fidelity ring true to a listener. Yup, there's one more, the logic of good reason. It is when narrative possess fidelity, they constitute good reason for a person to hold a particular belief or take an action. Thus, logic for the narrative paradigm enables a person to judge worth of a stories. The logic of good reason presents a listener with a set of values that appeal to her or him and form warrant for accepting or rejecting the advice advanced by any form of narrative. Guys, did you realize that some of advertisements we found or we watch on social media implement the narrative paradigm theory? Especially the apps that likely to appear on YouTube. Let me take you to watch this one commercial video and see how these ads change your perspective of this brand.
Bapak nggak puasa dulu deh hari ini.
Suamimu mana? Nggak sahur. Terus bapakmu? Bangunin sana. Panji! Ayo puasa.
Kan lapar, Bu.
Udah, kamu makan di belakang ya.
Ajarin anakmu puasa.
Iya, Bu.
Banyak amat.
Sekalian buat lebaran. Tarawih.
Iya, Bu.
Bapakmu mana? Ajakin sekalian tarawih.
Bapakmu belum punya loh baju lebaran. Kamu nggak beli?
Sejak ibu tinggal di rumah, hidup kita berubah.
Kita bawa aja deh, Ibu.
Yakin?
Iya deh. Kamu yang ngomong ya. Aku nggak tega.
Bu, kita pergi yuk.
Kemana? Kita mau kemana? Ini siapa?
Bu. Bapak tuh udah lama gak ada, Bu.
Izinkan sang waktu.
Ingatan ibu terhenti saat bapak meninggal Ramadan tahun lalu. Sejak itu buat ibu tiap hari adalah Ramadan.
Bapak nggak puasa dulu deh hari ini.
Kan lapar, Bu.
Ajarin anakmu puasa.
Lebaran apaan, Pak? Oh, nggak apa-apa.
Tarawih.
Iya, Bu.
Bu, datang lagi.
Adalah bunyi yang sejati di antara semua nada dunia. Harapku cemas gelap datang kembali. Hilangkan
beli baju lebaran yuk.
Jangan pernah berhenti membahagiakan orang yang kita cintai. Karena itu keren.
You see guys, through this advertisement, we are not only increase our exposure of this brand, but also it teach us a value of making our beloved one happy. Moreover, every time we get reminded of that value, we'll think about this brand, especially when it comes to Ramadan, a time background in this advertisement. Okay, that's a wrap for my explanation about the narrative paradigm theory. Hopefully, my video will bring a benefit and make you understand more about the theory. See you!